building a secret room.
What do you call water that's cold?
Cold water.
That's Aunt Poo Poo. Where's Aunt Poo Poo?
I smell freedom or cow poop. Can't really tell the difference right now. School.
To see who?
My crush.
Ooh.
I already know what these are! Oh,
Yay, it's a wrap.
today, Kelly and Kyler get a yes day!
You want a spanking?
Yeah.
They're not your gifts. You better not. I will whoop you.
We just got a tornado warning.
Take shelter
It does?
How long is it? Can you tell me first?
No, they're not long, okay?
Can you tell me first? I'm scared.
I am more than happy to leave right now if you're gonna act like this.
If you're aiming for second, save yourself the aggravation, save me the time.
I don't remember anything as soon as the camera starts.
I lost the ability to relate to non-famous experiences after the age of 8.
It was very destructive because it was based on fear.
Have you not had a margarita and a Vicodin and just said...
never. I can say that never.
I had this mentality of like, if you're gonna work me like an adult, I get to party like one.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to The Financial Diet, to our second ever video essay. As you might be able to tell from this video's title, today we are talking about how social media has both childhood and parenthood in a bit of a flop era. And I should remind you, as always, that there is a much longer, more chic, and totally ad-free version of this video available right now if you become a member of our society at TFD. Now, this is a subject that we've covered a little bit before, notably in our video all about how influencer culture is essentially eroding what little there even was of child labor protections as it pertains to entertainment. And we'll address some of the points that we covered in that video, but in our previous video on this topic, we only scratched the surface. And while child labor laws are part of the problem, the broader social culture that we're creating around children and motherhood is incredibly destructive to all parties, financially, professionally, emotionally, and basically every other way you can think of. And while this video is going to be talking quite a lot about children and childhood as it pertains to our digital world, to honor the values and ideas we're expressing in this video, we are not going to be showing children's faces. It seems like we're reaching a bit of a cultural divide when it comes to the relationship between children and the internet. On the one side, you have certain celebrities going to great pains to protect their children from the public eye, people who call out parents who overshare their children's lives online, and former child stars like Jeanette McCurdy exposing the many downsides of children working in the entertainment industry, including in her interview on my podcast, The Financial Confessions. But on the other, sharenting is not only the norm, it's become in many ways the expectation of parents. And we're also contending with the many reality series that make content out of children and teens. Now, I do want to be clear that while we did interview many people for this video, and some of them are parents themselves, I am child-free by choice and have talked openly about that decision here on this channel. So I want to be very careful not to be presumptuous about parenthood in any of the things I'm going to talk about, but I also want to dispel the notion that it's only parents who can care about what social media culture and technology culture more broadly is doing to children and to parents for that matter. And we may not be children today, but we all once were. And as someone who has lived her life publicly online since the age of about 21 years old, which I should say was not technically a minor, but in my opinion, way too young to really understand the implications of what I was doing, I personally feel very sensitive to the idea of creating a public persona of any kind for someone who is far too young to be able to meaningfully consent. But that's just my personal disclosure out of the way, child-free by choice, but very interested in protecting kids online. So now that my disclosures are out of the way, what is the context here? Social media is now a completely normalized part of a child's life, often even before they're old enough to have their own accounts. Some of you may have seen some of the viral TikToks of the past few months with teachers talking about how much children have changed in the past few years, how few of them are operating at grade level, how extreme the problems are with things like concentration, anxiety, and even just basic verbal and intellectual development. Now, I should point out that even the teachers themselves who are making these TikToks are pointing out that it's not just one factor. There are many things that are making children particularly difficult to reach right now, things like the pandemic, screen time, absent parents, many of whom are unable to be more involved in their children's education due to themselves being overworked, the teachers being overworked and understaffed, schools encouraging children to be passed along to the next grade even if they're not ready for it. And while it would be unfair and inaccurate to portray any of this as the singular cause to why children are struggling so much right now, a huge part of the problem is the impact of screen time and video/social social media consumption as the new normal for child development. According to a New York Times article, a survey published by the nonprofit research organization Common Sense Media found that overall screen use among teens and tweens increased by 17% from 2019 to 2021, growing more rapidly than in the 4 years prior. On average, daily screen use went up among tweens, ages 8 to 12, to 5 hours and 33 minutes from 4 hours and 44 minutes, and to 8 hours and 39 minutes from 7 hours and 22 minutes for teens ages 13 to 18. 8 hours and 39 minutes a day on average. The increases reported by the survey are most likely a reflection of the difficulties that families endured with school, childcare, and social interaction throughout the pandemic, experts said. Of particular concern to someone who tracks screen time is an upswing in social media use among children 8 to 12 on platforms such as Instagram, Snapchat, and Facebook, even though such platforms require users to be at least 13 because of a law that prohibits companies from collecting data from children. And with all of this excessive screen time, it's important to note that studies have well established that this screen time and social media use can have huge negative impacts on child and teen development. Although it should be noted that the impacts do tend to become different as the child ages, because notably the experience of being online as a teenager and all of the problems that come with it are still pretty different than when you were a very small child. But the evidence is clear. Spending this exorbitant amount of time looking at a screen and engaged in social media before you're even legally allowed to is bad for children. To learn more about this, we spoke with YouTuber and former teacher Natalie Parmenter, who I also interviewed on the Financial Confessions, all about why she decided to leave the teaching profession.
I think kids today are up against some pretty big challenges with their attention span. So we've seen studies come out of Microsoft and out of King's College that shows not just kids, but everybody's attention spans are a lot shorter these days. But when you're talking about children, they have about 2 to 3 minutes of attention per year old. So a 6-year-old maybe has 12, a little bit more than that, minutes. And so we don't have a lot of time to cut from their attention spans. So I think it's hurting them, especially in the school environment, because they can't sustain attention long enough to get through a lesson sometimes if they're getting a lot of iPad time at home. The other thing too is constant entertainment. Over my span of teaching, I started teaching in 2012 and I was student teaching and working in schools before that. I've seen over time kids are less able to entertain themselves. So then they're expected to be given entertainment. And then I think it's really important for kids to understand to be cautious more than ever. I think kids are getting served videos and they're just taking it as fact. And they need to know how to analyze things. They need to understand how to fact check and question, is this real? We see a lot of issues with kids just wanting to copy and paste Wikipedia articles or use AI to write things, and they never read back what ChatGPT gave them. And so I hope what to see from this next generation is that they're stronger at that than us.
And one thing that's also worth noting about this impact of spending so much time on our screens is that it's not just about the actual day-to-day development of the child's brain and their emotional health, it also impacts how they view their future selves. This huge emphasis on social media as the center of children's lives have led to outcomes where, for example, toy company Lego conducted a survey that found that YouTuber was the #1 dream career for children ages 8 to 12, with more than 3 times as many answers as astronaut. Now, I realize the irony saying this as myself a professional YouTuber, but it's worth noting that I didn't start creating on this platform until I was in my mid-20s, which is still a pretty young age to be doing anything at such a public scale, but definitely is a lot older than a literal 8-year-old. One of the people that we spoke to for this video is TikTok creator and all-around fabulous woman that I've been following since I got that platform, Sarah of Mom Uncharted, who acts as a bit of a watchdog for exploitative child and parent content on the internet. But notably, here's what she had to say about the rise in children wanting to be influencers when they grow up.
I think it's slightly worrisome, to be honest. It's also not surprising, specifically with the pandemic, right? We all went online. We saw this boom of influencing. these young creators, TikTok creators, you know, in their late teens, early 20s, making so much money and things like that. And traditional jobs weren't looking as appealing, specifically during the pandemic, right? Like we saw healthcare workers not get treated great, teachers not get treated great. So it's not surprising that like the youth who was spending, you know, 2 years online off school, seeing the hardships of traditional jobs, think, oh, well, this looks good. This looks profitable. This looks quote unquote easy. I would like kids to live more in the physical world versus the online world. So I'm a big proponent in delaying smartphones, delaying social media. And if in their teenage years they think like that is a realm they want to go down, then that's fine. But the thought of, you know, 6, 8, 10-year-olds thinking that that's their career is a little concerning given what we're seeing with like teen well-being and mental health.
Former teacher Natalie had a bit more to say on this.
When I started teaching, the glam job was being in the NBA or NFL. And I definitely saw a shift over the last 5 years of it turning into, I want to be on YouTube, or I want to be a game designer, something along those lines. I don't think it's unusual, though. Kids have always had dreams of being famous, whether it was the rock star or the movie star, but now it's just at their fingertips. And, you know, if you have a camera and the time and the energy, you can potentially make that happen for yourself. But as always, the concern here is that kids will do something dangerous or stupid or something that they will regret. You know, I think the fame aspect is really scary because we see very often now young kids and that are just skyrocketing to fame, and there's nothing to help them or support them. Like maybe their family understands what's going on, but the internet moves so quickly. You see, you know, just as quickly as kids get famous online for posting something, whatever they posted, we see them get canceled, or we see them get bullied online by rude commenters and trolls, and it can be brutal out there.
Now, part of the reason why jobs like YouTuber and influencer are so aspirational for children is likely because whether or not they even aspire to those things, their lives are already on display. So how have we normalized making children's lives a public spectacle? Now, I should clarify that part of the issue is just how much screen time children are allowed regardless, right? Like, if all they're seeing is internet creators, it's totally logical that that's what they would aspire to be. But a lot of it is about how much children's lives are publicized on the internet before they even have the meaningful ability to consent or understand the implications. So a word that we cannot do this video without defining is sharenting. As one article put it, sharenting refers to the practice of parents sharing photos of their children online. Usually images are shared on social media platforms like Instagram or Facebook and capture quotidian moments in children's lives, such as first steps, trips to the zoo, school performances, and holidays, for example. But as much as parents may want to share their children's achievements and lives with friends and family, sharing photos online can be problematic. A survey conducted by Security.org found that approximately 75% of parents shared a picture, story, or video of their child online, and more than 80% of parents use their kids' real names on social media posts. Now, obviously, the risks associated with having your full face and full name visible online are present at any level of visibility. But they do obviously increase dramatically as the parent sharing starts to get a larger and larger following made up of people they don't actually know. Back to Mom Uncharted.
I think it just kind of like happened, right? Like it started with the Facebook moms. Like first there was the mommy blogging community sharing mainly text, but some would share images and things like that. And then like Facebook came, and then you could share a little more, and then Instagram came, and then you could share a little more. And it just seemed to be a natural flow to oversharing that no one was really stopping to think critically about. And then personally for me, like it really hit during the pandemic when we were spending so much time online. I found parents sharing a lot more online because that was the only way to really connect during those times. So I think it was just like a natural, gradual situation that we weren't pressing pause to think, hold on, we should view this from the lens of the children and how it is for them and their autonomy and their sense of privacy and their digital footprint, right? I feel like we were just a little delayed on those conversations. It just all felt normal and we didn't really think about it.
I think right now a lot of the people that are having children are millennials, and we were the first ones to really have the excitement of Facebook and Instagram and putting our lives online. So at some point it probably just felt natural to continue, as they have children, to put their children online too, especially because we're not making photo albums anymore or sending pictures in the mail. This is how people communicate what's going on in their life. This is how they make that footprint. But there is definitely a dark side to this. A screenshot can carry your child way past the private page that you think you've set up for yourself. And if you are about to post a picture of somebody else's child, there's etiquette there, and you need to ask them what is their family policy on posting pictures of their children. I think you'd be surprised. A lot of people will say no, or not this type of picture. Because once you post it, they've lost control of their child's sort of internet footprint.
And to talk more about the negative mental health impact of growing up in the public eye, we spoke to therapist, YouTuber, and friend of TFD, Katie Morton.
I mean, we could say in general, social media will increase depression and anxiety because of the comparison factor. I also think that it is important for, quote unquote, regular children to not be posted about a ton online either, because I think back to when I was a kid, and I saw this recently is why I'm bringing it up, is a family friend posted about their daughter starting their period. And I was like, that's really not something, like, I was embarrassed about it. You're still trying to figure out who you are. And it's very uncomfortable. And we really need to consider, in the same way we would like saying it at a party, you need to consider what you post online about your children, because they don't get, you're removing their ability to consent to that. And then that information is out there. And that could mean that one of their friends' parents says it to them, and then they're teased at school, or someone makes a comment about something. They're like, how do you know? It's a boundary violation. I think any parent posting about their children, especially any kind of private information, really needs to consider and talk to their child first, because that the detrimental effects of that, I don't think we have quite understood. And I still would not be surprised if we see more increase in depression or anxiety or even bullying as a result of this.
So as I said earlier, many children become accustomed to the idea of their lives being displayed on social media and having a camera present for so much of their day-to-day life, that creating their own profiles or aspiring to do that professionally becomes a pretty natural outgrowth of the way that they are already socialized to behave. One thing that's just a side note, and Mom Uncharted covers this all the time in her content, is just how used to having a camera present children are becoming. Now, I grew up in the 90s, so I definitely remember camcorders coming out for like school plays or opening presents on Christmas morning. And I do remember that when that happened, there automatically came a sort of desire to perform, or at least a minimum awareness that you were being filmed. It's almost impossible to imagine for someone who didn't grow up like that, but the idea of having that camcorder present in almost every single day of my life, and for all of my more minor moments, you really start to see, especially in how some of these children behave when they're being filmed, that there's always sort of an ambient awareness that a camera is likely present. I'm sure it will take us at least another 10 to 20 years to fully psychologically unpack what it actually does to children's brains to essentially be performing 24/7 and to be filtering all of your natural reactions through a persona expected for the camera, but I'll leave that to the psychologist to deal with. It's also worth noting that many parents, especially more public-facing parents who use social media to some extent professionally themselves, have gotten into the business of actually creating entire profiles for their own children, with content that is managed by mom and dad, or theoretically being posted on their behalf but not by them. Sometimes you'll hear the dubious excuse that this platform will be very valuable to them when they're old enough to actually take over it and likely monetize it. Although to that I would say, girl, just reserve the domain name. You don't need to actually be turning your child into an unwitting influencer. Now, I'm not going to point to anyone specific here, although I can think off the top of my head about like 5 celebrities who've done this. I honestly just don't want to draw more attention to their children. But it's worth asking, especially with all of the labor law violations that we'll get into later in the video, is this practice going to become illegal at some point?
If you're filming your child during an emotional response, anything other than like surprising them with something, like you got tickets to Disneyland, I feel like it's an invasion. It's an overstep of a boundary, because the one thing I want all parents to think of is, how would you feel if someone put that content out about you? And yes, I know you're an adult now and you might be like, oh, I wouldn't even care. I'm a kid. I'll forget about it. Things are big deals to children. Think of when you were a teen. It felt like the end of the world when someone said something embarrassing about you at school, or like as a girl, I started my period, and if someone had seen it, I'd be devastated, right? You have to think of the ripple effects for that. And I can never support that. When a child is going through an emotional breakdown, who knows, maybe they have some emotion dysregulation struggles or other mental health concerns, to put that out online is extremely, to me, it's abusive. I feel like it's abusing the power of being the parent. It's an egregious act of disrespect to your child. And it's really important that we allow our children to be children and do so in the privacy of their own home.
There doesn't seem to be enough boundaries. And to me, it's not funny. It's upsetting that there's certain things that we can't all seem to agree on. Like, I find it interesting that law enforcement, online safety experts continue to say, like, don't share your children in the bathtub, right? And to me, that's like an intimate, private moment behind a closed door in a bathtub. It makes sense to like not share that. But like, we as parents in this digital world cannot agree to that, because those images are getting shared regularly. So I think that's very interesting, that there's just no boundaries and no agreement in what we can and can't share online when it comes to like what should be deemed private.
But speaking of the legalities, one of the experts that we spoke to for this video is attorney Alexis Mueller, who, as a media attorney with experience in cases involving children, had quite a lot to say on this topic.
Illinois passed a law in August, actually the first of its kind, that basically allows teenagers, so anybody above the age of 18 actually, to sue their parents if they appeared in their parents' videos at least 30% of the time over a 1-year period. And in that instance, they can then sue for compensation for money, which is a percentage of the revenue that the parents received. But that doesn't cover, for instance, situations where the child is or the minor is the main subject, right? So if we're talking about Kidfluencers or esports, or a situation where the child has their own channel, then in that instance, that law wouldn't apply. And when you're looking at this, I think it makes sense to really look at which areas of the law you think would protect, but then don't. It's a difficult topic, right? Because if you look at the spectrum of the creators out there, you have some people who just, my daughter is a perfect example. She loves this one channel that she's watched that is a father who's an illustrator, and every once in a while his son or his daughter is on the channel and they'll be drawing with him and he'll show them how to draw, and they'll show what the kid's version of it was and what his version of it was. And they're part of the, they're part of the fun. But then there's other examples that I've read about online where people are adopting children or fostering children to basically create a family video, and they're giving them scripts. And if they don't follow the script, they won't get fed, or they will, there are any number of other types of rather austere discipline will be visited on those children, to the point where in some instances, Child Protective Services gets involved. And if that's the only avenue we have for protecting child performers online, we have failed. That's not to say that children can't sue their parents. It's just under what statute? Because in the end, anyone can sue anyone for anything. But you have to state a claim, you have to make out the elements, and it's also a state-by-state issue, right? Like, who are you suing? Your parents? Are you suing YouTube? Are you suing, right? Who are you suing, and where are you suing them? And then once you do, you'd have to review, with an attorney in that state, the laws of that specific state.
Now, you might be rationally asking yourself at this point, well, if we know that such a heavy social media and screen time use is bad for children, and we know that making them super public online makes them very vulnerable, and we also know that, especially as it pertains to content that might be monetized in some way, you're likely in violation of some labor laws, why do parents keep doing it? Well, definitely not for all parents and not for all instances of sharing, but one undeniable incentive is just how much better content performs statistically when it involves children. I'm going to cut to myself from our prior video on this topic, who can give a little bit more of an explainer on exactly why the business of posting children online is so hard to say no to. A child's presence in YouTube videos can rake in considerable profits. In 2019, the Pew Research Center found videos with children who appear to be under the age of 13 received 3 times as many views as other videos. 9-year-old Ryan Kaji, star of the Ryan's World YouTube channel, topped Forbes' 2020 list of highest paid YouTubers, estimated to have netted $29.5 million from his content and product lines. And while I do believe that that story is in and of itself quite heavily compromised, when compared to other examples of children being leveraged for the good content engagement they provide, the outcomes can be much darker. From the same Newsweek article, one prominent case saw a Maryland couple, Mike and Heather Martin, who ran the infamous Daddy of 5 channel, lose custody of 2 of their 5 children and end up sentenced to probation for child neglect. The Martins' content involved inflicting emotional torment onto the children under the guise of pranking. In one, the Martin family accused their 2 sons of having made a mess by spilling ink, screaming and swearing at them while the young children cry and plead with their parents. In another, Mike Martin taunts his distressed young son and then shoves him into a bookcase as the boy tries to rush past his father. The channel had more than 700,000 subscribers, and their videos were watched millions of times. The Martins subsequently took the videos down and issued public apologies, but also said that they were just an act. "We were going for shock value," Heather Martin told a local TV station. "What you see on our YouTube channel is not a reflection of who we are. It's not. It's a character. It was a show. A bad show, but it was a show." And while I should definitely be clear that the one-to-one incentive of posting children equals making more money is definitely a bigger issue for people who are actually making money off of that content, social media was very literally designed to be like a casino where we put in our content and see if we hit the big time. And even at a very small personal scale, seeing a post that gets a lot of engagement, that people like and comment on and celebrate, is very much designed to give us that dopamine rush and would be nearly impossible not to enjoy. So even for the individual parent who is not making money off of this, the huge discrepancy in the performance of content that doesn't have children and that does is designed to addict all of us. When you post a random photo of a meal you made and it gets a couple likes and maybe 1 or 2 nice comments, versus you post a gender reveal photo or a newborn pic or a first birthday or a child's Halloween costume, and you get triple or more the engagement and everyone you know telling you how happy they are and how beautiful your kid is, it's going to be pretty hard to say no. Back to therapist Katie Morton.
I mean, we all know like algorithms and people wanting more views. If when your child is in the thumbnail or your child is in the video, it does better, people are going to be more predisposed to do more of that. And then that puts an undue burden on the child. And the level of anxiety, I mean, we could talk mental health concerns. And I really think it's an incredibly unhealthy space for children to be put in.
COPA, which is the law that protects online privacy for children, does not apply to situations where the parents are involved, because the parents aren't a business and the parents have almost not quite proprietary, but a stewardship, sort of a guardian, custodial interest in their child's privacy. Actually, I saw as I was preparing, for our talk today, that there was some research done, and even the average parent, not an influencer, not what's the phrase that I've heard people call it a sharenting. There's research that shows that even a normal parent will post over 1,000 images of their child online by the time they are 5 years old. That is a surprisingly large number. And then I did some introspection. I looked at myself, and I've stopped doing it recently. But for the first 3 years of my daughter's life, my ex-wife and I shared quite a bit of her life online. And that's before money is involved, before brains are involved, before the kid shows any kind of interest in doing it. And, how do we protect a child's interest when they are not old enough to understand that, if we're going to quote the Social Network, the internet is not written in pencil, it's written in ink. And so this indelible life echo that gets cast onto the internet is something they can't contend with once it's out there. And I think privacy regulations are going to come into play, as well as financial regulations that will protect the financial interests of the child performer. They're just not there yet.
But it is worth noting that this feedback loop of parenthood and especially motherhood being so valuable and so valorized puts an incredible pressure on mothers. But where does this huge, undeniable pressure for mothers to seem perfect online actually come from?
Being a mom is hard out here in these streets these days.
Tell me more, tell me more.
You can't phone this stuff in.
Perhaps what's most notable about the sharenting phenomenon, both amongst individuals and people who make it their full-time jobs, is how much it is an expectation of mothers. From theconversation.com, while parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles share images online, research shows that it is mothers who post more information about their children on social media, particularly when it comes to family photos. It is also mothers who are largely the focus of disapproval and judgment for their sharenting. I didn't even think about this until we were working on this script, but if I thought about the top 10 mothers that I see on social media who post a lot of content of their children, and that's most of them, I actually don't think almost any of their husbands really post any content about the kids. Some of them don't have social media, which fair enough, but even the ones who do and do post other things, the discrepancy between how much the mother posts and the father posts, if you actually stop to think about it or look at your social media feeds, it's pretty jarring. It is also worth noting on that note that there has been a rise of the dadfluencer lately, which I assume is an outgrowth of our broader cultural tendency to congratulate fathers for just doing the bare minimum of what's expected of them. But it is interesting, and we'll link you to a New York Times article about this in the description, that those dadfluencers face far less vitriol from their audiences about the content that they're sharing and the ways that they're parenting than their mom counterparts do. But the overarching dynamic that it is mothers who share this content and who are expected to perform motherhood visibly creates a pressure for mothers to reach an almost unattainable standard, especially financially when it comes to how their motherhood looks from the outside. Back to Mom Uncharted.
Being in this realm for so long, I think that a lot of moms don't have a physical village that, we speak to often. And so they go online and they can form these digital villages and this community and relate to other moms and have support, right? The quote unquote job of motherhood often goes unnoticed. And it is a lot of work to be a mom. And so to be able to go into a community and have other people, respect what you do or learn your tips and tricks, I think is very beneficial. However, personally, I believe all of that can be done without turning your children into content and making them the main spotlight of your page. I think parents need to stop sharing so much online. There is the platforms that can do better in not pushing this content, and there's potential legislation that could do better to protect the rights of children and their privacy. I recognize the difficult in regard to that in America with the laws and how they discuss, parent-child relationships and things like that. But, we've never had a world like this. We've never raised children in the digital world. So for me, laws do have to adapt and adjust. Things aren't the same as they were 20 years ago. And kids they deserve privacy and they deserve the ability to play and form themselves not online with the judgment and critique from the outside world.
Now, it should be said that in addition to being pressured to portray a motherhood that is immaculate from a developmental, psychological, and emotional perspective, the dominant image online of what motherhood should look like is one of affluence. When you think of some of the most popular mom creators, you're often imagining things like pristine spaces, light color palettes that would be hard to keep clean, large homes, which is a topic that we've covered extensively on this channel, bursting kitchens stocked to the brim with packaged foods that cost God knows how much, and just a general feeling that money is never an issue. Because let's be clear, many of the most popular and influential mom creators, aside from having many children, also themselves don't work full-time, if at all. which is, just to get on the same page economically, damn near impossible. I just assume all of these women's husbands are like hedge fund managers at this point, because I don't know what else they could be doing to support 8 kids on one salary. But we'll get into that a bit later. But beyond that, the very idea of presenting motherhood as something aesthetically appealing and effortless enough to document as aspirational content sets any normal human being living in a normal house up to seem like a failure in comparison. Because even if you're doing a great job, chances are your place doesn't look presentable 24/7. The act of getting food on the table, or getting your kids ready for bed, or doing their homework is not something that would be aesthetically appealing. Again, I'm not a mother, but I was a full-time nanny for many years, and I can tell you that few things would have stressed me out more than knowing that that nanny cam footage I'm sure was being taken of me was also going to be distributed to a massive audience. But even without this pressure, there is still an underlying expectation that a woman's work, her passion even, should be rearing children and keeping her home, even when she's also expected to work full-time. Author of the incredible book Fair Play and former The Financial Confessions guest Eve Rodsky spoke to this issue in my interview with her, so let's go back to that episode for a second.
What happened was in the 50s, and at the end of the war in the mid-40s, when these men had to come back, it was, well, what are we going to do with all these women that are here? We need to push them out so that men can take over their patriarchal structure that they're used to having and take their jobs back. So we really, for 2 decades, we really had this big push to push women back into the home. And so that was sort of the classic Leave It to Beaver time in this country, where we saw the cultural expectation of a perfect housewife. You can see it in Mad Men. But then what happened in the end of the 60s, where women started to enter male professions again. And so there was a revolution, like you said. Women became primary, secondary earners in droves in really interesting ways. But there, as you said, there was no childcare, no other revolution to change the imbalance of what women were still doing from the 50s and 60s. So now we see women are still holding 2/3 or more of what it takes to run a home and family, and they are relied upon to either be a co-breadwinner, or in many cases, like my mother, who was a single parent, she was holding all of the tasks.
Now, it would be impossible to talk about this very specific image of motherhood and how it became so popular without talking about the influence of religious fundamentalism. Now, for those who may not know, many of the most popular original mom creators, and even some of the most popular ones today, specifically came from a background of Christianity and often more specifically Mormonism. But regardless of denomination, we're talking about communities with a very strictly gendered interpretation of roles for child rearing, especially in contexts where mothers are either discouraged or explicitly forbidden from working outside the home. So that entire idea of being able to raise 8 children on a single income doesn't just feel out of step with modern life because it's so economically impossible. It's also because it is a religious paradigm of what a family should be that the vast majority of the country doesn't today subscribe to, even if they are religious. Things like Mormonism, evangelical Christianity, the Quiverful movement, and other fundamentalist sects have an outsized level of influence on the mom blogging community. Again, even while themselves not being a very typical representation of what the average American looks like, even a religious one. Now, as I mentioned previously, some of the most iconic and formative members of the child blogging community were in fact members of the Mormon Church, sometimes even the fundamentalist branch of FLDS, and much highly fascinating ink has been spilled on the reasons for this. As one Christian Century article put it, this cultural moment dovetailed perfectly with the Mormon belief that the intentional public sharing of joyful motherhood is something akin to a religious duty. For advertisers, it was a match made in heaven, and Mormon women were quickly ruling the algorithm game. The culture of Mormonism encourages a kind of genre of family life, says Laura Vance, author of Women in New Religions. It's such an oversimplification to call it an all-Americanness, but this way of being a family I do think is very appealing, especially in the modern world where the reality of life is so much more complicated for many, many people. It's also worth noting that when you look at Mormons as a community, in addition to their more strict interpretation of gender roles, they are also on average more affluent than the average American, which almost certainly feeds into the ambient appearance of wealth that is basically the overall aesthetic of mom blogging. Now let's get back to Mom Uncharted to hear a bit more about this.
I think we've seen it a lot specifically from like the Mormon mom community that gets talked a lot about on social media, and specifically Instagram. And I think it is a way for that community who, is natured that the women are to, bear children and serve their husbands and like be at home, the ability to bring people along and profit off of what they're doing at home, right? And also like spread the word of, God. It's kind of like it feels very like a mission, like missionary to me, right? That this is a way that they can respect their religion and stay at home and serve their husband and do all the domestic tasks and stuff like that, while also spreading the word of God and sharing their tips and tricks for, keeping a clean house or whatever it may be.
I also am not going to get too into this because I think we're going to be doing a much bigger video on MLMs in the future, but it would be impossible to talk about the religious influence on the online mom community without at least mentioning how much it intersects with MLM culture. Now, as we've discussed before on the channel, MLMs in particular target communities that are ripe for turning into sales and recruiting networks. And few communities are more adapted to this than under and unemployed mothers and religious networks. We actually spoke in a previous episode of the Financial Confessions to an ex-MLM 1%er who was also at the time a very active religious community member. She can speak to this phenomenon better than I can.
Do you find that the MLM sort of industry and the culture that surrounds it is very prevalent in Missouri?
It's very prevalent in places where large groups of people gather regularly, like churches. It's very common in those things because if you are a part of a church, you have a built-in network. So I left the church, like 35 now. I left the church when I was like 21, 22. And I was like, I'm never going back. I'm done with this. I was raised in fundamentalism. And so I get a lot of comments that will say like, well, you're stupid. You should have known better. Everyone knows MLMs are a scam. You asked for this. And it's like, I didn't know it was a scam. And I was raised in fundamentalism to not question anything because you have to take everything on faith. And if you question something, well, then you're questioning God and you basically need to go and get right with God. So it was for me to just dive right into the MLM industry, it felt like I had that community back that I had missed from being raised in church and having that huge core community that I was with 2 to 3 times a week. And I missed that. And I just remember thinking like, oh my gosh, this feels like church without the religion. It's awesome. But I noticed that there were lots and lots of women who were very religious, very active in their churches, their mega churches. So there seems to be that theme.
So whether from MLM recruiting, lucrative sponsorship deals, or just the rush of an increased level of engagement on everyday content, sharenting, especially with that very old school, often religious view of what a mom should be, is very solid business.
I think there is a lot of pressure online in general to show the highlight reel, right? The perfect look of everything. I mean, I'm a sucker for something on TikTok where it shows like someone putting away everything in their fridge and their fridge is so nice and clean. And I'm like, whose fridge is like that, right? There's so many ways to compare and to feel like we need to do more, buy more, be more. And I really think it's important for all of us to check in. A key thing that I do, and I've done it every year in different ways, we're coming up on the end of a year and a new year, beginning of New Year is a nice fresh start to consider your use. Now, I personally don't keep track of how long I'm online. I think that would depress me, but I do pay attention to, again, how I feel before and after I interact. And if I find myself watching something or engaging with someone and feeling like I am not good enough, like I'm not keeping up enough, I feel like I need to purchase something, I pay attention to those kinds of indicators in my own brain and I mute people for a while. It has nothing to do with them. I'm not saying that they're toxic or bad. There's no shame. This is all on me. This is me as an adult recognizing the fact that when I engage with certain things, I don't feel as good as I do when I don't, and taking to action to make that better. And so if you are someone putting content online and you feel like you have to put up this perfect household and this perfect, being a perfect mom, I would encourage you to pay attention to those feelings and consider what actions you can take to feel better.
But it's not just about the finances of performing motherhood, because when you bring money into the picture, it's also about understanding just how damaging it can be when the children featured in this content are put to work so young. So how exactly are children screwed over when they're put to work so young? Now, of course, the broader culture that we've created here is the real culprit when it comes to glamorizing careers in the media to the detriment of young people. But we wouldn't have gotten to this point if we already had laws in place that protected children in these spaces. And I want to establish something very clearly. These children who are performing, whether it is on their mom's Instagram or on shows like 19 Kids and Counting, are working. Creating content is actual work, and especially when that content is being directly monetized, they should both be able to meaningfully consent and also to receive some of the financial benefit of that work. Part of the problem here is that we don't tend to think about children's lives being displayed as engaging in labor, even though we would likely think the opposite of the adult who is similarly displaying their own life. Like, no one would debate that a lifestyle blogger deserves to earn the money from her sponsorships, but many people would have trouble making the distinction that her child who appeared in that sponsored video also deserves the money. The most important thing to remember when it comes to child labor laws is that federal laws in the US do not extend to the entertainment industry. That is left up to states, most of which do not have legal protections in place for children working in entertainment. From an onlabor.org article, for the states that do, such as California, the laws are typically referred to as Coogan laws. The hallmarks of Coogan laws are that they typically mandate state-approved work permits and require that a certain percentage of a child actor's earnings be protected in a trust account, rather than under the control of the child's parents. But currently, the scope of Coogan laws is limited to the traditional entertainment industry and does not extend to children that are earning money via social media. So let's talk a little bit more to our lawyer and hear what he has to say.
The first thing you have to look at when you're looking at a minor, obviously, is that as someone who is a minor, they don't have the capacity to enter into a valid contract. They can, but in the end, that contract is voidable by the child. They can disaffirm that contract at any point in time. Even after they reach majority, they have to actually ratify the agreement for it to no longer be subject to being void by the minor, which means that most companies won't enter into agreements with minors. They will enter agreements with the parent, and then the parent will make the child's services available because they'll just say, well, my kid is enjoying this, they're having fun, and what's the matter with recording them having fun and making a little money on the side? The trouble that you get into is the child doesn't have the ability to object to that because the parents' parental autonomy, so the family autonomy rights under family law, are pretty absolute, and it's a very tough area for the legal system to get involved in, because parents will say, this is my house, these are my children, and I can control what goes on in my household. And so short of abuse, family law won't get you there either. Then you'll go beyond that and say, okay, let's see who's making the recordings, or if it's in the parent's house, if the parents are making the recording, or if the parents are supplying the video equipment to make the recording. Well, now you could argue that the parents own the copyright. So now the kid doesn't even control the copyright in the video that was created, because the parents are the author, or rather the people who recorded the work. And so under copyright law, that won't protect you. Well, then surely you would say child labor laws would apply. But child labor laws really only apply to contractors and employees. In this instance, the child likely would be neither of those things. The child would just be recording themselves, or the parent would be recording the child doing something that they arguably might already be doing. Because this industry blurs the lines between what is an employee, what is a performer, and what is a freelancer, it doesn't really allow the labor laws of the states or of the federal government to apply to the creator industry. The closest thing you have is the Coogan laws. Jackie Coogan was a performer that was I believe he was first discovered by Charlie Chaplin and appeared in The Kid, the movie, and then later he was Uncle Fester. And he had made plenty of money before he was Uncle Fester by being in the Charlie Chaplin movies and various other things. And then his parents spent all of his money. And when he got old enough, he sued them and he made very, very little money. So he made it his life's work to make sure that there are laws in place to protect child performers. Parents have to get a state recognized permit. The money has to go into a trust account. The trust has to be administered. It's a block trust, which means the parents can't touch the money. The parents can administer it below a certain threshold financially. Once the trust makes a certain amount of money, then there has to be a third-party trustee involved. Well, that sounds very good. Unfortunately, the Coogan laws don't apply to creators, don't apply to influencers, don't apply to people in the home. And so there's been a lot of movement amongst advocates in the field to maybe have these laws apply to creators.
It should also be noted that when the lines are blurred between home and the workplace, as is so often the case with children being used in their parents' content, there's no legal definition to qualify the kids' participation as work, and thus no precedent for them to be entitled to any portion of their parents' earnings. It's also a bummer, but needs discussing, that even since the prior topic on this video aired, the already weak labor laws in place protecting children have gotten even worse. From a Vox.com article, earlier in 2023, Republican state lawmakers in Wisconsin circulated a new bill that would allow workers as young as 14 years old to serve alcohol in bars and restaurants, down from the state's current age minimum of 18 years old. The legislative proposal creates a simple solution to workforce staffing issues, said the Republican bill sponsors in a memo that they circulated to colleagues. And from epi.org, according to the Economic Policy Institute, both violations of child labor laws and proposals to roll back child labor protections are on the rise across the country. The number of minors employed in violation of labor laws increased 37% in the last year, and at least 10 states introduced or passed laws rolling back child labor protections in the past 2 years.
The thing that's of concern to me is that a lot of the movement here to loosen labor laws has been on this menial labor side. And if you look at the view that these people might take of influencers, I don't think it's going to necessarily be a positive one, right?
We go a lot further into this in our director's cut of the video, including more conversation with our lawyer, and it is bleak. I also do want to talk here about the fact that while child labor is often framed through the entertainment industry, where we're most used to seeing children work legally, the largest impacts on this weakening and rolling back of child labor protections affect the most marginalized communities, notably migrant children workers. Especially in industries like agriculture, all across the country, children are working right now, and in fact, they're often working in conditions that violate even adult labor laws. So caring about this stuff isn't just a matter of making sure that Nickelodeon stars get longer lunch breaks, although that is also important. It's making sure that all children, regardless of where they were born or what their immigration status is, have equal protection when it comes to not being exploited. And even if labor laws were somehow magically resolved and comprehensively protected children on social media the way they do in films and television, although again, that is still insufficient, there would still be the huge problem of negative mental health impacts of being a public figure. It probably goes without saying at this point that being a public figure at a young age can have extremely detrimental effects on a person's mental health. That's certainly been the case with many former child stars, so it's completely logical for the same to be true for child influencers, content creators, and reality stars. As former TFC guest Jeanette McCurdy herself pointed out,
why shouldn't people be allowed to be child stars?
I think, I do think the union tries hard to protect kids as much as they can, but I just don't think that production companies are watching out for the kid enough. I think they're too concerned with getting their hours in and getting their project in the can and wrapping it up all nice and tidy and turning things in on time. And then there's the fame element. So I think there's the kind of production company element, and I don't think developing minds are equipped to handle fame.
And do you feel that if our audience, now let's be honest, you guys are a discerning, elegant bunch. I know you're not trawling TMZ and stuff, but it's the impression that I think a lot of people get of child stars and former child stars is often in their moments of crisis. And we see them as these little angels that we project all this stuff onto, and then we see them as adults who can't cope, essentially. What are words of advice or context that you would give to people who are seeing these adults in the media maybe not act in a way that we think is becoming?
I would say if there's a way to have empathy for the fact that these people probably did start this thing at an age where, you know, they're probably under 10 years old, let's say, more often than not, and they were expected to they had so much pressure on them, such a high standard, so many expectations that are impossible to meet. You can't please everybody. You can't please the network and the family and the agents and the managers. It's not going to happen. And I do think if you're put in the business from a young age, you're robbed of the ability to develop a sense of identity. So I think you're then left with that loss when anything starts to fade or decline, when your career starts to fade or decline, or you don't know what the next step is, or you leave, whatever it might be, you're then going, well, who am I when I don't have the world telling me who to be?
Right.
And I think that's a question that I understand why it leads to the breakdowns that it leads to. It makes so much sense to me, but I think hopefully if somebody considers that question, they might be able to have some empathy for them, because it's not, it makes me really sad. It's not just a joke. It's not a thing to laugh at. It's not like, oh, that person got a tattoo on their face and shaved their head, so haha, that's what I'm going to be for Halloween. It's like, God, it's really upsetting.
But let's hear more from our therapist, Katie Morton, on this subject.
I do know, and what I have seen is that the backlash, the pushback, the children growing up and, you know, making some kind of video or post about the fact that they felt like they were robbed of their childhood. I mean, we've seen it in, even when I was growing up, whether it's like, you know, any kind of childhood star, a lot of them ended up suing their parents because they took all the money from what they earned, or they were forced to work. You know, I think there unfortunately is sometimes a icky underbelly to this type of content, to this type of pressure on children. And as they get older, especially because we talk about mental health more, yay, you know, I'm like, the next generation will be better than the one before. That's wonderful, but I think we will probably see some of that. I haven't heard of it myself, but I wouldn't be surprised. But I also believe that it's not right for children to be put online when they can't consent, because the main backlash I've seen and heard from vloggers that essentially grew up online, because I've been on YouTube since 2011, so they're like grown now, right? Is that they didn't want their most vulnerable, their most embarrassing, those awkward stages broadcast to the globe. And they feel like they can't take that back, right? We all know once something is put online, you can't take it back. And they didn't get the chance to choose. When a child has to provide financially for the family, that can mean that they don't really get to be a kid. They don't get the luxury of, I get to go play and I don't have to worry about things. They have deadlines, they have schedules. It's essentially like what you and I know of as work. I mean, people talk about Sunday scaries and things like that. They feel that anxiety from a very young age. And then because of their lack of development, that responsibility can feel very heavy and make it hard for them to relate to children their own age, because I'm sure most of the kids they spend time with don't also, you know, make all the money for the family. And then they don't get to be, and this sounds bad to say, but be reckless like a child, like run around and have to wait for the whistle to come in at night and not think about the fact that bills have to be paid. I feel like we have so much of our life that is spent hustling and thinking we have to earn because bills keep coming, and we really need to protect childhood so that they can still have that. You know, when you and I look back on childhood, we often think, you know, oh, it was so nice, there was no responsibility, and essentially we're robbing them of that and taking that away, where their only focus should really be on being a child and learning in school, learning how to socialize and share basic things like that.
And as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, I started posting content very publicly at the age of like 21, 22, several of which went totally viral when I was completely unprepared for it. And that experience was deeply unpleasant for a lot of reasons. Like, there was harassment, there were really creepy people in my DMs, there was huge backlash over things that I recklessly said. I had no editor, no oversight, and no idea what I was doing. And again, part of the reason that I'm so passionate about having children be online at an age where they don't even understand the implications of it is because I know that even as a very young adult, I was not able to handle the blowback of being so public. And I luckily was able to make a career in media, to make amends for stupid things I'd said, and to generally build a life for myself that didn't depend on having a squeaky clean Google search result. But many people are not so lucky. They do and say and write things online at a very young age that can prevent them from having a job in normal professional society for literally years, in addition to all the in-the-moment trauma that it can cause. And that's just talking about the internet currency of attention. We're not even talking about when there's actual currency involved. Because even if the children are not facing the pressure of being their family's meal ticket, content creation and media jobs don't necessarily set children up for long-term financial success. When people come into a lot of money at a young age, and again, that's assuming they're even getting their proper cut, it's commonly understandable that they wouldn't know how to handle it responsibly. Look at the bankruptcy rate amongst former professional athletes, for instance. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, nearly 16% of NFL players have filed for bankruptcy within 12 years of retiring. And one reason is that they earn a lot in a short period of time while they're still quite young. According to ABI.org, athletes typically hit their earnings peak within a few years of finishing school. Across the three major American sports, MLB, NBA, NFL, the average career length is about 4.6 years. Thus, the average athlete's career is over at a young age, and the typical player is only at their peak earnings for an extremely short period. Most never earn at the same level again. Some athletes may never think about an alternative career path after retirement, and without formulating a retirement plan or a proper budget, young athletes blow through their money. And as bleak as it probably is to say, as we talked about earlier in this video, so much of the currency of online attention and zeitgeist is inherently tied up with youth. We can all think off the top of our heads of many, many child and teenage influencers, actors, reality stars who low-key fell off after they were no longer young and adorable or super relevant. Part of the reason that I think we at TFD have been able to make such a long-term sustainable career out of online content is because our audience was always much older by YouTube standards. We're geared toward adults, and because we're in the educational space, we simply don't have the same pressures to remain young or relevant or trendy that many other creators do. I will never forget the first time we went to VidCon, and I realized that most of the creators I was used to watching, people who were my age or older, were mostly catering to an audience of literal children, often tweens and teenagers, but sometimes even younger than that. The currency of the internet is attention, but youth is often a license to print money online. And for many of these creators, when you no longer have that to cash in on, you're likely going to hit a bit of a financial wall, if not an outright existential crisis, which many former creators have also experienced. But on that note, what happens when the kids grow up?
While I was touring my original music, I learned that I had $0 left in one of my bank accounts.
So one thing that's really worth discussing here, and I'm going to just talk about this over a montage of some of the headlines and documentary series and exposés that have been created to talk about this phenomenon because, as I mentioned, we don't really want to be showing children's faces here, but we do want to be illustrating just how much of a problem it is. But anyone who has watched the children of very prominent mom and family creators, who's watched the reality shows centered on children like The Duggars and John and Kate Plus 8, or Here Comes Honey Boo Boo, or Toddlers and Tiaras, or even some of the shows focused on adults but heavily featuring their children, like my beloved Real Housewives franchise, knows that problems befalling these kids as they age out of their cute, adorable bankability is more the norm than the exception. And as we mentioned earlier, in most cases, the children literally aren't being paid for their appearances on these shows or in this content, and there's almost no oversight into their labor. So in addition to having to reckon with all of the, in some cases, terrible things that befell them while they were being paraded in front of a national audience, and having it be the top of their search results for essentially the rest of their lives unless they do something else extremely notable, which will usually necessitate them staying in the public eye even if they don't want to as a career, you also have to reckon with the emotion of parents who signed away your childhood to do this, in exchange for, in some cases, very lucrative checks, in others, just the chance of being famous. You might have seen some of these headlines about former child influencers and stars now growing up and suing their parents, or have seen some of the documentaries at how fractured some of these family relationships became. Some of these parents have ended up in prison, have been exposed for heinous crimes, or even baseline just totally estranged from their children for having agreed to do this. Let's check back in with Mom Uncharted.
For child actors, I almost think that they had more privacy. right? They were playing a role, right? Whereas a lot of these family blogging kids and influencing kids, they don't have safe spaces. Like their home is their stage, and they are not playing a role. They are just existing as children, all in the public eye, without their knowledge and their consent. So, from the time they are born, somebody is making the decision for them to be a public figure. And if they continue throughout their life, that's a long life of being in public and a lengthy digital footprint. And I think the assumption can be made that they might experience a similar fate.
But I should note that these cases we're talking about, the reality stars and children of massive influencers, are the more extreme ones. And it can be easy when you think about how we're approaching childhood and parenthood online, that if you're not signing some huge contract with TLC, that you're sort of exempt from the repercussions. But as we outlined earlier in this video, just the act of being so heavily on their phones and in content themselves has a huge impact on children and parents, even if it's not widely publicized. One of the most notable is the skyrocketing levels of anxiety that we're seeing in both children and parents, because no matter what we're doing, no matter how we're parenting or the choices we're making, no matter how the children are represented, there's always a way for it to be wrong or to be exploited. According to APA.org, about 11.6% of kids had anxiety in 2012, up 20% from 2007. But during the pandemic, those numbers nearly doubled, such that 20.5% of youth worldwide now struggle with anxiety symptoms, according to a meta-analysis of 29 studies. And from the Center for Research, it's pretty common knowledge at this point that social media can hugely impact mental health, especially in young people. In 2021, leaked documents revealed that researchers at Instagram found that using the app was harmful to teen girls' and boys' body image. About 1 out of 3 teen girls felt worse about their bodies due to using the app, and so did 14% of boys.
I think we've started to see people take a step back on posting and limiting how much they post about their children, or I think I've even personally started to see a lot of friends starting to have babies and they don't post that they're pregnant at all. Maybe they don't even post until the child is born, but they do a picture of the hands and the feet and not the face. And they're starting to save the pictures for the group chat or just to frame in their own home and not put out there in the world. In the end, I think those children will appreciate it because they'll be able to tell their own narrative when they're older and not be backtracking from an embarrassing baby photo, or if they no longer have a good relationship with that parent, they don't have to be forced to look at these pictures of themselves popping up in memories anymore. And they'll just get to have a better control over what they look like on the internet.
And what the doctors and professionals are saying, the US Surgeon General said this year, 16 seems to be a better age in regard to like a sense of self to come online. And again, all children are different and all children are unique. Some are a little more mature than others, but I generally would say I would like to see more parents hold out on social media until, like 15, 16 years old, because it's, I'm a 38-year-old woman on there, and it can be very hard for me as an adult sometimes. So I can't imagine what it's like to live in that world at an early age when you are developing yourself. I didn't have Facebook until I was 21 because that's when it came out. And I still look back at that and think, oh, did I have to upload everything on my camera roll that weekend and things like that? And I see what teenagers and young adults are doing. And there is a lot of them are not going to be happy with what they were posting at that age. And, I think that's a very relatable thing to all of us. But it's just more so now because they're producing so much more content on these platforms. And, you never know what can affect your future as well.
So that brings us to the final question. In the words of the iconic Azealia Banks, so What now? We've already started to see more and more influencers and media figures leave the platforms that were once responsible for their income, and to only see how much more difficult the platforms were making their lives after quitting them. From a BuzzFeed article, "In just a few weeks I had so much mental clarity," said Jessica Kirby, a fashion and lifestyle blogger based in Rhode Island, "to the point where I realized it's almost like Instagram was giving me brain fog because it's just so consuming." So if we know that this is the toll depending on the algorithm for validation brings adults who can consent to opt in, how can we feel okay allowing it to take over children's lives, either on the user or creator level? As with almost anything we talk about on this channel, individuals can certainly find ways to make changes in their own lives, but a societal shift in regards to how we consume media and how children are utilized will only come about with policy level changes. And according to a Politico article, we are starting to see some changes in other countries. For instance, in France this past February, members of the National Assembly's Law Committee unanimously greenlit draft legislation to protect children's rights to their own images. The message to parents is that their job is to protect their children's privacy, said Bruno Studer, an MP from President Emmanuel Macron's party who put the bill forward. On average, children have 1,300 photos of themselves circulating on social media platforms before the age of 13, before they're even allowed to have an account. France also amended their child labor laws in 2020. Children under 16 working in entertainment have been required to obtain administrative working authorization, and the new law was brought in to include content made for video sharing platforms. Now, I'm not saying the laws passed in France are perfect, but they are a step in the right direction, and most importantly, acknowledge that children aren't just objects to be paraded for clout. They're human beings, and they have every right, as much as you or I do, to decide to what extent they want to engage with all of this stuff, especially considering all of the negative impacts it can possibly have on them.
So there's something interesting that happened recently. I reconnected with some students of mine that are now in high school, and a lot of them started to follow me on Instagram, and I asked them before I followed back, can I follow you? Just to make sure but the one thing in common that I thought was interesting was all of their profiles were on private, and none of them had any pictures posted. And so I let them into my life, and they can enjoy seeing me have a beer on the beach or whatever it is. I don't teach them anymore. And I know nothing about them. And I thought that was so interesting because I think at that age, I was on MySpace, and I was so frustrated with the only 8 pictures I could post, and was deleting and posting new things all the time, and was so obsessed with making my online footprint. And they didn't seem to have much of one at all, or whatever's happening is maybe locked down a lot more, and they are sharing just to close friends and things. So I actually, even though I wanted to see some cute pictures of them, I was actually really happy to see that. Like, maybe they have learned the lessons from the older generations about being more cautious about what you put online.
Just like anything, we have more avenues for connection and communication, and that can sometimes come along with negative effects as well. And I feel like, honestly, if parents would just take some time every day to check in with their children. I know I'm busy too. Everybody has a lot of stuff going on. But if you're going to bring a child into the world, I feel like it's part of parenting now, where you have to have conversations about their use of social media, asking your child, hey, do you feel better or worse after you're on TikTok or Snapchat or Instagram? Or, what are you doing? How are you feeling? Having those conversations is really key, because we need to protect them from even what could look like a benign profile or a benign person could make them feel worse about their situation. They could internalize, oh, I need to have this, or I'm not cool, or, oh, I don't look like them, I'm not good enough. And we want to make sure that we nip those potential worries or thoughts in the bud.
I am someone who has built a career and a life that I love, making content on the internet that I feel great about. But I am able to make that choice as an adult, and more importantly, do it with my committee of other board members who decide this as a group. Even as a functional adult with a couple brain cells to rub together, I still don't feel like I can totally trust myself alone to make all the big picture decisions, let alone if I were a child. I believe there can be a place for good, thoughtful, meaningful content creation that makes our lives better and can be a viable career path. Again, I'm an example of that. But I also believe that it has to be an informed choice, and making that choice for children before they even understand what the question is can no longer be an acceptable norm. It's bad for kids, it's bad for mothers, and it's bad for the world we live in. I'll see you guys next month. Scroll safe.